Lots of people love David Garrison's definition of movement. Okay, and he says that it's, I don't know it right off. Do you have it memorized at all? Okay, it's about a spontaneous, rapid multiplication of churches around the world, and all that kind of stuff. It sounds great, okay? And as a starting point, I think it is good. Unfortunately, it leaves a lot of gaps. And what I found is people are saying if it's going slightly faster than what they'd experienced before, then it's movement. So if what they experienced before was one church in 10 years and now they're getting 2 churches in 10 years, they say, I'm part of a movement. Or if they sit there and they say, I've never started Bible studies, and all of a sudden they start 4 in a year, they go, I'm part of movement. Okay? And so I am not saying that this is the definition from the Bible that movement should be. So don't sit there and say, Paul said that Jesus said this is what movement is. I think I can back it up, but it's an argument. It's a human argument based upon Scripture, not necessarily something that came straight out of Christ's mouth. Okay? We looked at some of those problems and we said, how can we define movement in such a way that's not constrictive, but that motivates people to a particular set of action? Okay, to do certain things. So we said, what things need to be done? If you look at the parable of the sower, that's kind of where some of this stuff comes from. Okay, so you had you had the seed that fell on the ground, or the rocky soil, and never took root at all, or in some cases it took root, it was eaten by crows. You have seed that fell on rocky soil, it took root, but then withered by the sun. You had seed that fell up on soil that grew, but then was choked out by thorns. And then you have seed that fell on the good soil that multiplied 100-fold. Okay? So this is where my definition of movement comes from, is I say, okay, God wants us to see the 100-fold, right? Okay, or more. So for movement, we say, okay, we want to see 4 generations of church. And I've already told you what that is. Okay? Because church is that whole, it multiplied. So a church that starts a church that starts a church. So when I say generation, I mean you go and start a group and you're not part of that group. This is not you gathering a group in your house. Okay? This is a group that you led a guy to start in their house. That starts a group, that starts a group, that starts a group. If you start 4 groups, that would be you starting 4 groups, and these would all be first generation groups. They wouldn't be 4th generation groups. But if someone from this group then goes out and starts another group, this would be 1, this would be 2. Okay? Does that make sense? So we're talking about 4 groups. Why do we say 4? That was extrapolated over time. We looked at first to say, okay, once we saw 4th generation groups, that movement was most likely to continue and wouldn't stop when we removed ourselves from leadership in it. We stopped, we stopped at 3. So if you find very, very old trainings of ours, you'll say 3 generations. But we found that there was like a phenomenal increase in the movement itself, the sustainability of the movement, if we just increased that to 4th generation. By 1 generation, we knew that the potential of it continuing after we were gone was there. We would take a look at everything as if tomorrow, if I'm going to be martyred, would it continue? That's our mindset. And if I was hit by a bus, if I was martyred, if I got sick, if I had to go back home because one of my children were ill, if I got removed from the equation, would it continue? We always ask that question. It's a little bit morbid, granted, but that's the mentality we have to have. Okay? So I look at generations. These are generations. Then I sit there and say, but only 4 studies, even if it's 4 generations, that's not quite a movement, right? We wouldn't say that 4 new Bible studies in an area is, it's certainly exciting, especially in areas like you guys have in the UK and I have in the Northwest United States where I'm responsible for, where we don't have that kind of thing. It's very exciting. Leads you to dancing in the Spirit, speaking in tongues if you believe in that sort of thing. And how you do, I don't care. That's not for the subject of this conversation. But it is very exciting, okay? We should be rejoicing. But in terms of sustainable movements, what we've observed is there needs to be at least 100 churches. Okay? I can't tell you where that number came from. It didn't come from the Bible. It came from looking at movements that were sustainable, that would continue after we were gone. And it seemed to be there needed to be 100 churches, and most of those need to have multiplied up to the third and fourth generation, and mostly fourth generation. Okay, so if we see 4 generations and not at least 100 churches, then we don't count it as a movement. If we see 100 churches, they're all single generation and not fourth generation, we don't count it as movement either. Because we could have had a very gifted evangelist go and start 100 groups, but when you pull him out of the equation, those groups may die. Okay?
From those four consecutive groups, you're talking about 100.
Yeah, so...
saying 100...
Yeah, it's 100 altogether. It is 100 all. So if this guy started here, okay, and he starting 4 groups. Yeah, and he went down to 4th generation or 4th generation. You could either do it, it's never that clean. It would be nice if there were 5 chains and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, you may have this chain that never multiplies, this chain that multiplies down to the 10th generation, this chain that multiplies 2 generations, and this chain that multiplies to the 20th. We've gotten up to 18 generations in India. We've gotten up to 10th generations in California already in 2 years.
It's not, if you counted the total number of churches, it's not 100, it's 100 churches that have multiplied. It's not the total number of churches in there.
It is the total, it is the total number of churches, but most of them have multiplied, and most of them have started multiplying to the 4th. Okay? So 2 churches in a 100 church block to the 4th generation, we go, oh, next year. Okay, we don't sit there and say this year. Now, we've got to add a time frame to this too, because if you were to look at any 1,000-year snapshot in history, you would say there was movement. In the UK, there has been movement, right? We've seen movements begin in the UK. We've seen movements end. We learn just as much from what it takes to begin movements as it does watching what caused them to die. And so we needed something that would help us identify when they began and when they ended. And so we said, okay, we want to see this in 3 to 4 years. We used to do a smaller number, and once again, that number, when we started looking at some of the harder areas of the world, this gets back to changing the distance. When we looked at some of the harder areas of the world, like in the Middle East and in Southern Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, we started saying that 2 to 3 years wasn't enough time, that we needed to look at 3 to 4 years snapshots. I don't think we should expand that for the UK at all, but so I think that that's a good definition for the UK, but I'll come to where I got the 10 years before the end of this training. If I don't, come back to me and hold me accountable to answering that question, because it's important. Okay, so we chose 3 to 4 years. Now this is a sliding scale. So in every 3 to 4 year snapshot, we should see 100 churches started that are at least 4 generations deep. So if we move over, so we had 100 churches in year 1 that met the qualification of movement, year 1, year 2. In year 3, we weren't seeing new 4th generation churches and new 1st generation, all that. Then we start to go, uh-oh, something's wrong here. The movement's slowing down or stopping, and we start asking the questions, why? We actually have this situation in some of the places we're working in Africa, where they believed that movements began simply through training, and they didn't include a coaching and mentoring aspects of it. So the movement rose to the capacity of those they had there who already knew how to coach and mentor. But because the coaches and mentors never replicated themselves, the movement plateaued when they hit their level of capacity. Now they're having to go back and as fast as possible raise up coaches and mentors so that the movement will continue growing. Okay? In this, we've talked about multiplication of groups. It's not referring to multiplication of leadership. Okay? So if you start a group and out of this group you start mentoring a leader, that doesn't necessarily mean that that leader is considered second generation. He's just a leader you're doing. But all of you really need to see, if you're going to aim for something, set a goal for yourself, a fourth generation of leaders. So when I'm doing an accountability conversation with my father, he asks me, he says, he doesn't sit there and say, do you have 4 generations of leaders? No. This is what he does. He goes, tell me the stories of the ones that you're mentoring personally. And I'll sit there and I'll tell him the stories. These are the groups that I've trained. These are the stories of their leaders. The reason he's interested in stories is because are they just names on a chart, or do they people I know? So I tell him stories. And then he asks me this question. So tell me the stories of the ones that they're mentoring. And then he wants to know, and tell me the stories of the ones that they're mentoring. So when I get back from this trip, it would not surprise me at all if he says, tell me about Peter. And I have to sit there and tell him the story of Peter. And then he says, so tell me about some of the leaders that Peter is mentoring.
That means you have to behave, Peter.
No, it's impossible. He's going to sit there and say, tell me the stories of the leaders that Peter is working. And I'm going to sit there and say, well, I met this chap named Ben, and he's a pretty good fellow. And I've got to tell him about Ben. And then he's going to say, well, who else? And then I'm going to tell him about Wendy. And then he's going to sit there and say, well, can you tell me any of the stories of leaders that Ben and Wendy are working with, or people that Ben or Wendy are working with? Well, because I was in Wendy's house the other day, and I've heard some of the stories of those fellows in guys and gals in the groups there, I can sit there and say, yeah, there was this guy named Danny, and there's this woman named Joe, and there's this woman named Kay. And I could sit there and say, and here are the stories that I've heard of them and the fruit of their obedience, even though they just got baptized like last week. You know what I mean?